This story took place a few years ago. It could have happened to anyone, but it happened to him. Everything that happened to this man was a tragic coincidence. He wasn't bad or good. He was just like everyone else. It's just that she chose him. Enjoy listening. My workday turned out to be terribly heavy, and I had to walk home, sleepy and tired, because my car broke down, and taking the metro was out of the question due to my status. Faye, that was a silly joke. I just hadn't seen the starry sky and breathed in the fresh July air for too long, even if it was September outside. If only I knew how my walk would end, I would have called a taxi right away. I walked past tall, stylish buildings and breathed in the city smells. Big city for big people had to look accordingly. Numerous lights flickered around, countless cars rushed past, couples in love and business people walked through me, and I could smell their perfumes, catching snippets of their conversation. I regretted not experiencing this more often. I walked, blending into the September atmosphere, the cool night air always smelling like smoke. Yes, there are no bonfires in the big city, but my childhood was spent in a village where I was born and lived until I finished school and moved away. That's why autumn will always smell like smoke, evenings will be warm, and nights cool and transparent. Suddenly, I was distracted from nostalgia. The reason was the realization of the complete absence of the white noise that surrounded me, plunging me into memories. Maybe I went the wrong way, so at first I wanted to turn back. But my navigator showed that I was still heading home. I had never walked through this park before. Moreover, I had never walked home. With my schedule, I had no time for walks, so the car and the map were my friends and helpers. As I walked, the further I went into the park, the more uneasy I became. Apparently, my lifestyle had greatly weakened my self-preservation instinct. If I didn't call a taxi after the first thought that something was bothering me. I noticed another detail. There were no sounds at all, not even the sound of my footsteps. That's when I remembered that absolute silence is only characteristic of the deaf. So I finally turned around and quickly headed towards the park's exit. The further I walked away, the closer I heard the strumming of a guitar and some other noises. And when I reached the presumed source of the music, saw her, a woman in a red dress. She was dancing, clicking her red heels on the asphalt path, her movements mesmerizing me. I stood and watched her, just watched, and when my legs painfully ached, simply sat down on the ground. She kept dancing, swirling around me, and then she froze. She just stood behind me, and I, though weakened by fatigue, stared into the distance. I woke up on the ground. It was the same night, the same street. Several people surrounded me, responding to my questions about what happened with Short. You felt unwell, and you fell and have been lying here for about 15 minutes. I, on the other hand, didn't remember anything. Only the thought of some girl was swirling in my head, but who she was, whether I knew her at all, remained a mystery. The first thing my nose sensed after the smell of camphor was the scent of grave soil and some decay. My face twisted, but no one else did, so I dared to ask, "Do you smell that?" People began to sniff around, but detected nothing. Someone asked, Should we call an ambulance? To which I shook my head negatively and asked instead to call a taxi. A man from the crowd dialed a number and began to dictate the address. I wasn't particularly good at spatial coordination, but the address the stranger gave to the taxi driver, that street was on the other side of town, quite far from my workplace, let alone my home. How I ended up here at all was a huge mystery to me, and I blamed it all on the mistake of that man. But the taxi that arrived a couple of minutes later convinced me of the reality of what was happening. 5 minutes later, I was already sitting in a yellow car and speeding to the other side of town, to my home. Various versions and scenarios were swirling in my head. Maybe I was kidnapped and dumped as far away from home as possible. Or maybe I just got drunk and went in the wrong direction. No, nonsense. I wouldn't smell like alcohol. And if I were kidnapped, they could have hit me or stolen something from me. But I feel great, and the most valuable thing is with me. I'm not even dirty. The more attempts I made to give a reasonable answer to one question, instead of the last one, 3 more similar questions popped up. It was confusing. To pass the time, I pulled out my cell phone and texted my acquaintance. He could answer any question, and it didn't matter so much whether his gibberish was logically explainable or touched on more mystical, I would even say mythical, otherworldly things. Either option suited me. I was dying of boredom and incomprehension at the same time. I was right as always. My friend immediately read my rather strange message, and just as quickly gave me a link to some other legend, saying, "Isn't this the woman you saw?" I clicked on the link, and I was introduced to one of the sites where all sorts of fortune tellers and clairvoyants push their paranormal crap to ordinary mortals. He even remembered my grandmother, who at one time taught this stuff, and me, nostalgia. As it is supposed to be, such sites always have sections with fortune telling and lore, which is where I actually ended up. The yellow title on a dark brown background was quite simple: Deadhead. I'd expected to read some scary story in the style of ancient spirit from American Russian Germany who kills virgin souls. But then there was a rather simple short story without colorful details. The Deadhead, or the woman in the red dress, is the name often given to an undead soul that visits our world to this day. She comes to our world to satisfy her hunger and drag another unfortunate person to the grave. Her legend says that she was a poor dancer whose husband died, and then her young son, which she could not bear, and maddened, stabbed herself on their grave exactly 1 year later, on the day of her and her beloved's wedding, 21.09. And then I started to remember. The park, the red dress, the dance. A woman who matched my image. I had never believed in mysticism, but a certain interest took hold of me. Turned my attention to the date, September 21st. I'd seen it somewhere. Shit, it's today. Yes, a brilliant discovery, but what can you do? I don't remember anything that happened to me during that day. The information I'd seen wasn't enough, so I texted my friend that I'd found some similarities between the girl in the park and the woman in the legend. He didn't reply, but threw me a couple more links. decided to save them for later. The cab driver's voice distracted me, and I got out of the car after paying him. While I was getting to the apartment, I opened the first link, where there was more information. It took me about half an hour to study all the information given to me. In brief, learned that Maria, that was the woman's name, comes once a year on the day she kills herself, having previously dreamed or seen the victim in the form of a live dancing girl. Her victims stab themselves with the same dagger that she stabs herself with, thus binding herself to them through blood, which is something like a sacrifice. Of course, I went deeper into this case, but quickly lost interest. I wanted to sleep again, and the story again seemed to me implausible because of the facts above. So I left the case until tomorrow morning, and went to bed with the idea that if anything happened, I would go to the police, and that the spirits were a fiction. But I didn't sleep long. I woke up in a cold sweat because I dreamed of that woman again. But this time she wasn't so beautiful, and she wasn't twirling in a dance. Rotted, somehow miraculously not decomposed body of greenish-brown color, and in a piece of red tattered cloth, only remotely resembling a dress, stood only sometimes swaying and looking with her empty eye sockets directly at me. There were bones sticking out. On her head was a wreath of very withered old roses, which fell from the slightest movement. Wearing red shoes stained with earth, she was covered in earth. In her right hand she held a dagger. Then, just a moment later, her ugly face appeared right in front of me. Jumped out of bed and headed for the kitchen. Damn, an all too realistic dream that I tried to forget by trying to wash my face a couple times with cold water. I admit I was scared. Too much coincidence and realism. I had not encountered such a thing before. I was afraid of what I had dreamed, and because of that, I stayed in the kitchen for a while to calm down. When I returned to the room, I saw something my eyes couldn't believe. On my pillow lay the dagger that the monster from my dream was holding. I froze. My brain completely stopped working and my body stopped obeying me. My legs led me to the bed, and I took this terrible thing in my hands. At that moment, the door behind me slammed shut. I wanted to run away. I wanted to throw the dagger away, but I couldn't. The stupid body was no longer my body in any sense, and I continued to stand. Behind me I heard a wheezing sound, and my shaking hand moved a little farther away, as if aiming where to stick the shiny thing. Then I turned around. Tears even flowed from my eyes. I didn't want to die, but what I saw killed hope in an instant. That woman was standing in front of me. The smell of rot hit my nose and her hand pushed my arm, and I felt steel piercing my heart. My body lay in the apartment for a long time before I was discovered. I wasn't found until 3 weeks later. As it turned out, no one cared about me, and no one even noticed in the first few days of my absence. The officer who handled my case wrote it off as suicide, even though it looked like it. And the comrade with whom I corresponded in a cab and who shared information with me preferred to delete the correspondence and say that he knew nothing. My unquiet soul will now search for new victims with this girl. You remember when we go hunting, don't you? I'll remind you on September 21st, we'll find a new victim. She probably won't have a suicide note either, and the case will be closed as a suicide. Remember that date. Maybe you'll be the next victim.